Thank you, everybody who has joined us for today's program, Artistic Insights with L.F. Tantillo. This will be the first of several talks that we are going to do with Mr. Tantillo during the run of the exhibition, A Sense of Time, the Historical Art of L.F. Tantillo, on display at the Albany Institute. My name is Patrick Stenshorn. I am the Director of Interpretive Programs at the Albany Institute. We are thankful for all of you who are able to join us from all over the globe today. During today's program, we will have a presentation by Len. At the end of the presentation, we will then open it up to some audience Q&A. We do ask that if you have a question for Len, that you please type it into the chat box, and I will then moderate and read all questions to Len for answers at the end of the program. This program is sponsored, as is the exhibition, in part by the Dutch Culture USA program by the Consulate General of the Netherlands in New York. If you are using a device that has a camera on it, please feel free to have that camera turned on and off during the program, but we do ask that you please make sure that your microphone is muted. As many of you know, Len, who is our featured speaker today, is a graduate of the Rhode Island School of Design. He is an architect by trade who left that career to pursue a career in the fine art of historical and marine painting. Since that time, his work has appeared internationally in exhibitions, publications, and film documentaries. He is a fellow of the American Society of Marine Artists. His work is included in the collections of the Fenimore Art Museum, the Minnesota Museum of Marine Art, of course, the Albany Institute of History and Art, numerous historical societies, and corporate and private collections in the United States and abroad. He has produced hundreds of paintings and drawings of New York State history during his career. And in 2016, he was elected a fellow of the New York Academy of History. So at this time, I would like to have you all join me in welcoming L.F. Tantillo, and I will invite Len to share his screen and begin his presentation at this time.
Well, thank you, Patrick. And it's so much fun to be able to look at the screen and see so many faces. It's not quite the same as a live audience, but I see so many of my friends and classmates, people who I haven't seen in years. So thank you for all of you for participating. And so today, this is part one, as Patrick mentioned, of a series of programs. And in today's program, I thought I would give you a bit of my background. Kind of take an overview of the exhibition, but this is going to be, it'll give you some idea of who I am and the kinds of influences that shaped my career. So I'm going to switch over now to my PowerPoint program. So let me just make a couple of adjustments. So as Patrick has said, this is part of a series. Wait a minute. Okay. So first of all, my background is my family was on my mother's side and my father's side from Italy. The Tantillos from a small village in the hills above Palermo, called Balcino in Sicily. That's my grandfather and my grandmother. I'm named after him. His name was Leonardo. My grandmother's name was Francesca, I never met either one of my grandfathers. They died um, long ago. They died before my when they were very young. My dad's father died when he was 6, and my mother's father died when she was 4. The Moriello family is from the area near Naples. And if we kind of zoom in, my grandfather was born on the island of Procida in the Bay of Naples. You can kind of see Naples there in off to the right. Um, this is what Procida looked like in the time when my grandfather was a boy. His name was Antonio Sciano Moriello. And my wife and I went back to visit in 2007, and I took a photograph from almost exactly the same perspective. And the place has hardly changed at all in the last 100 years. In a wider view, on the left side of the image, you can see Vesuvius, Mount Vesuvius, and in the haze, the distance is the city of Naples. If any of you have ever watched the movie Il Postine, The Postman, that film was made on the island of Procida. In my grandfather's younger days, he was the skipper of a small merchant vessel. These small ships had a single huge lateen sail. They were called liudo. And the crew would be, about 5 or 6 sailors. In his case, they were mostly cousins and relatives. I had an uncle who was familiar with this vessel when he was very young, and remembered being on it, and remembered that everyone called my grandfather by his nickname Ando, A-N-D-O. His first name was Antonio, but it was Ando for short. In his later life, the Moriellos moved to Marlboro near Newburgh, New York. They had a small farm there. In the left photograph is my grandfather with my mother's oldest sister, Mary. And in the photograph on the right, my grandfather sort of coming down the walk there. The old farmhouse is in the background. The woman is my grandmother, and the little girl is my mother. We used to spend every Christmas Eve in that house. We spent Christmas Eve with my mother's family and Christmas Day with my father's family. So my memories of those days in that house, my grandmother had 7 children, so I had a lot of cousins, and we would exchange gifts. We'd open our gifts on Christmas Eve, and we'd play games, and then we would have the Feast of the 7 Fishes. I grew up in New Paltz, New York, and New Paltz was a beautiful little town, and it still is to this day. I went to both elementary and high school in New Paltz. That's Main Street. But the thing about New Paltz, I think that was so great, was the landscape around the town is just beautiful. The hills, the Schwangunk Mountains, the ridge, and some of you who might be familiar with this area, that unusual outcropping cliffside in the background. The little tower that you see on top of it is part of the Lake Mohonk resort that's called Skytop. And that's all my memories of New Paltz. That's probably the most familiar and iconic image that I can recall. I was influenced, even as a little kid, by the stone houses on Huguenot Street. There's a fantastic open air museum there, the historic Huguenot Street Museum, and that's a great place to visit because you really do step back in time. The buildings date from the early 1700s. There are tours given, but I think part of my experience growing up was that these buildings may and aware of a past. Who lived there and what were their lives like? I think that curiosity was sort of born out of the experience of walking up and down Huguenot Street. One of the biggest influences in my life is the river. I was born in Poughkeepsie, New York, and although this is a view from which isn't too far from Albany, the view from the hospital where I was born was very similar to this. It was high above the river, and so I can only imagine that as an infant, my mother's stay at the hospital, she might have just brought me over to the window and pointed out the river to me. I don't know, but for some reason, this has become an ingrained part of my life. I grew up in a grocery store, Tantillo's Market, which was just outside of New Paltz in a little four-corner area called Bayaville. This is was taken in the late 1800s, and the building in the background was the post office and a general store. Over the years, a house had been built alongside of it, attached to it. This is what it looked like in the 1930s when my father bought it. And this is what it looked like when I was growing up. This is the 1950s. My brother and I shared a bedroom above the store. I'm going to try moving my cursor around. This was our bedroom window here, and the only view we had was the back of this Coca-Cola sign. So there wasn't much of a view beyond that, but I do recall how that Coca-Cola sign was mounted to the roof very well. This is the inside of the store. That's my dad behind the counter. And that's a picture of me when I was a little kid. And that sailor suit was probably something that I really wanted. I was always interested in, I guess my favorite cartoon in those days, Popeye cartoons. And so I guess I wanted to dress like Popeye. I tried to draw him. I could never get him right when I was a little kid. And then as I grew older, there were other experiences and other heroes. This was one of them. This is Fess Parker in the garb of Davy Crockett. I don't know how many people in the audience remember that, but in the 1950s, this was one of the biggest movies. Walt Disney's Davy Crockett, the King of the Wild Frontier. I can remember the song. Every kid in America wanted to be Davy Crockett. All of us, I mean, everywhere. So I got a Davy Crockett outfit. My mother got me a Davy Crockett outfit, and I paraded around the neighborhood with my little rubber knife and coonskin cap, and imagined myself back in the hills of wherever, Kentucky or the Alamo or whatever. And as I got a little more sophisticated, my attention was a little bit more focused on this guy, Humphrey Bogart, and I emulated him. Now I was changing. I didn't want to be Davy Crockett anymore. I wanted to be Humphrey Bogart. So I had a little Humphrey Bogart outfit. The first television instructor in art was John Nagy. We got our first TV set in the early 1950s, and he had a program that was only 15 or 20 minutes long. It was on once a week, but the program was called Learn to Draw, and every week he would do a drawing. He would show how you could take circles and squares and cubes and arrange them, and he gave little lessons in perspective drawing. And so I sat dutifully in front of the TV set with a piece of paper and a pencil and tried to copy the drawings. It was a lot of fun. And to this day, I still have my John Nagy book, and some friends of mine even gave me a John Nagy official pencil, which I lost mine a long time ago. I went to Catholic school, elementary school. We were taught by Benedictine nuns. That's me in the photograph on the bottom right at 8th grade graduation. The class was very small. There were only 16 of us in the 8th grade graduating class from St. Joseph's Catholic School in New Paltz. 13 boys and 3 girls. Not very good odds for the boys, but and probably not much fun for the girls either. So after elementary school, I went to high school at the public high school in New Paltz Central. And during that time, a lot of very close friends, friends who whose friendship I still cherish to this day. Quite a few of them have passed away, but the remaining ones, we do try to stay in contact with each other. That's a photograph of me. This is the staff of the yearbook, the Huguenot yearbook. And the tall guy in the middle is a good friend of mine, Bruce McKinney, who I had known since I was 5 years old. His mom and my mom were best friends. And Bruce and I have never lost touch. And we've collaborated a few times on a number of projects, including paintings. And in addition to the sponsorship of the Albany Institute show that's been provided by the Dutch consulate in New York, Bruce is also one of the major sponsors of the exhibition. I went to college in Rhode Island at the Rhode Island School of Design, and that's in the 1960s. This was the college building. This was the cafeteria, refectory, and sort of general purpose large space where we had concerts at certain times. Not much in the way of dormitory facilities. After your first year, you lived in an apartment. I was part of the architecture program. And this is a project that I was working on for a structures class. The thing about Rhode Island School of Design was that even in the architecture program, it was the art aspects of it that were always encouraged. So we had to design a hypothetical structure that would be possibly recreated at full scale in concrete. And what we did was we built our forms out of cardboard, and then we reinforced our structure with wires and then used plaster to simulate the concrete. So this would have been, I think, maybe second or third year. This is an architectural design project, a theater. This would have also been around that time. This was a conceptual idea. This was my degree project. The School of Architecture was a 5-year program. And this was an idea of how the school could be expanded into available spaces like parking lots and alleyways between buildings. And this is the model of the degree, my degree project. Ignore the car crash here and the chariot and all the Roman warriors. That was the best I could do for figures for the model. But I was always building models. I built model airplanes when I was a kid. At Rhode Island School of Design, everything was three-dimensional. We built, if we came up with an idea, we built a digital model, no, not a digital model, a physical model, a cardboard model, usually made out of chipboard. And so I had a lot of experience with working with three-dimensional space in that way. This is my girlfriend in college. Her name is Corliss, and in my 5th year at Rhode Island School of Design, we were married, and we're still together, and we've been together for 52 plus years. That was probably one of the best investments I ever made in my life. Well, then graduation came, and it was time to actually find a job and start making my way in the world. And I was really shocked that when I got my first jobs in architectural offices, I wasn't recreating. I wasn't doing any kind of master work, master architectural achievement. I wasn't Frank Lloyd Wright. I wasn't Le Corbusier. I was a draftsman doing fairly ordinary working drawings. And in the beginning, I wasn't even doing working drawings. I was filling out door and window schedules. And this went on for a while. This was the first few years of my apprenticeship in architectural firms. Um, but after a bit, the principals in the firm realized that I could draw. And so they started to give me work doing presentation work. And that involved presenting proposed ideas to the public. And the strange thing it was sort of shocking to me that they didn't encourage, or they didn't even want architectural designers to build models. So here we were doing three-dimensional projects. We were trying to design buildings, but we couldn't model them physically. We had to draw. And I think it was it was the fact that I had to draw everything that kind of, it pushed me further into a skill set that I didn't have before that, a drawing skill set. And the way the drawings were done, it was fairly basic perspective drawing. You would have the plan of the structure. In this case, very, very simple house sort of shape with a ridge line, an elevation off to the side. And what you did was you projected all these lines over to a view plane, and then using the geometry of vanishing points, you could construct a representation, three-dimensional representation of an object. And obviously, the more complicated the object, the more complicated the drawing was. But with experience, I got so that I could do this with fairly complicated buildings. This is an example of one of, I don't know, hundreds of architectural perspective drawings I made at that time. I couldn't resist putting this kid in and this kite sort of flying up. I guess maybe the bosses didn't notice that because they let me get away with it. After doing that for a number of years, I realized I actually didn't need to work in an office to do that. I could set up my own business and provide a freelance architectural rendering service to anyone, to any architects or engineers out there that could use the service. And so I set up my own business. I had developed a little more advanced skills so that I could work a bit quicker. And I started doing architectural illustrations for a living. And I did, I don't know, hundreds, thousands of them. I think I counted up one time. I did over 500 or 700 parking lots. I got really good at depicting cars. And the drawings were varied depending on who the architect was and what the design looked like. Occasionally I worked in color. This book changed everything for me. This is Burden's book on architectural delineation. And his theory was that to do complex architectural subjects, to depict them two-dimensionally, a technique that could be used was to build a simple model out of cardboard, light the model, photograph it, and then use the model as the basis for the final drawing. And I started doing it, and I never went back to perspective drawing after that. I just continually did that. I have hardly any of these models left. I probably should have saved a few of them, but I do have this one. This is the just a very model of the King's Hospital in Albany in the 1750s. And this is looking straight down on a cardboard model. But if I rotate that model backward, you can see that what I've built actually is the front and side elevation. You can see the entry gate, you can see the tower, and all the little tick marks along there were the location of chimneys. And so that was how I went about figuring out with the dimensions and what this building may have actually looked like. The models became quite complex. This is a model of an architectural project in Schenectady. And a big, complicated building like this is just something that would take forever to draw out longhand. So the model, I could rotate the model, I could photograph it from different angles, and that's how I managed to do that drawing. Saved a lot of time and gave a realistic effect. At least the dimensional aspects of it were correct. And the jobs got bigger and they got more widespread. I started getting many jobs from outside the area, Boston, New York City, Philadelphia. And the work itself started to change. I did a number of these sort of collages and different kinds of subjects, including historical subjects. And about the early 1980s, the jobs became so numerous and so widespread that my clientele started to include some of the biggest and most influential architectural firms in the United States. Robert Venturi had an office in Philadelphia, and he was the architect that got the commission to design the Westway project in Manhattan, which was a restructuring of the entire West Side Highway to kind of convert it into a park. And so there were items that I made for this, and they all got a lot of attention, including this front page of the Metropolitan section of the New York Times. And when this came out, and I realized that I was getting to a point with my architectural rendering where it really wasn't going to go beyond. It was as good as it was going to get, working with famous architects and working on prestigious projects. And it just didn't do anything for me. I felt like I really, I needed more in my life than just to continually draw very similar kinds of things over and over again, regardless of where they were located, designers were. So I started kind of reflecting on art that I enjoyed, that I was impressed by. Obviously, because of where I live, the Hudson River School, Olana isn't very far from my house. But there was Frederick Church's paintings and Kensett and Sanford Gifford and Thomas Cole. Beautiful paintings, all set in a very pristine landscape. One of the things about the Hudson River School painters is that they weren't very fond of the cities of their time. They were much more interested in the spirituality of the natural environment. But the paintings were beautiful, and they did take you away. They did bring you to those places. The artists that I found more fascinating, this is a Howard Pyle illustration, Maxfield Parrish, E.W. Cook, British painter, marine painter. Down here, probably one of the most famous of all, this is Rembrandt. And over here is Willem van de Velde, the younger, who was one of the greatest marine artists of all time, and that was 400 years ago. And then there were the contemporary painters. These were all artists that belonged to the American Society of Marine Artists. Bill Muller, who'd been doing Hudson River steamboat paintings his whole career. Stobart, John Stobart, probably one of the most famous contemporary marine artists today. Don Demers, an incredible painter, and Chris Blossom, a good friend and also an excellent painter. I love that work. I found it inspiring. So what was I going to do? I wasn't going to do commercial work anymore. What was I going to do with my career? Why history? Why do I paint history? Why do I paint New York State history? Why am I interested in grassroots history? Well, one of the things that I noticed was in the work that I had been doing, was the career of James Ates. James Ates was an inventor, an amateur, but Ates was a documentarian. In his lifetime, he made many watercolors of the city of Albany the way he recalled it as a child growing up in Albany. And what he left behind was a legacy of historical documents. He gives us an insight into what this community was before the era of photography. And I understood that he had a great place in the visual history of this area. I found that to be such an incredible accomplishment for him. About 100 years later, another Albany artist, David Lithgow, came along, and Lithgow was a better painter than Ates. And working with the historical information of his day, he created a number of paintings of Albany. And in looking back, I think any historian that looks at his paintings that are supposed to depict the 17th century will see 18th and 19th century buildings in the background. David didn't have access to the kind of historical documents that exist today. So I never faulted him for things like that wrong. I was always impressed with the fact that he dug into it, that he did what he could do, and he made his contribution. And so between Ates and Lithgow, I thought there would be a place for me to add my contribution to that history. So the first painting that I tackled, I had no idea how hard this was going to be. I decided that I'd do a painting of Albany shortly after the Civil War. This would be set around 88. So I studied photographs, mostly from the collection of the Albany Institute, but also in the personal collection of Morris Gerber, who had been compiling photographs of the area. And I studied each of the photographs, and then using the skill that I had for architectural rendering, I made my first painting. I did work with Don Ringwald on the steamboats. He was considered one of the great authorities on the Hudson River steamboat era. So there's accuracy in this, and there's a scale to it, but it's a good documentary piece, but not the greatest painting. But in working on that, I started across names. The one that stuck in my mind was Fort Orange. So I kind of wondered, what is Fort Orange? Where was it? Who built it? And there are some documents that have some information. Historians have text from that time. They have communications that were correspondence between the people who lived there and the people who were still in Europe. So there was that sort of information. And in 1970, the archaeologist Paul Huey had conducted a dig on the site of the fort, and he had found bits and pieces of the remains of the fort. So I had a sense of its size, I had a sense of how it was built, and then working with historians like Paul and Charlie Gehring at the New York State Library, the New Netherland Project, and others, I did my painting of my interpretation of Fort Orange. Now, I did that painting over 30 years ago. And over the course of the last 30 years, I've redone this painting, I think 14 or 15 times, each time refining it with new information that would come in from just different interpretations of the documents and different interpretations of the archaeology. This is a painting I made of the fort that was built before Fort Orange. This is Fort Nassau. I had no real idea what it looked like. That's why I sort of stuck it in the background in the mist, because I figured if I got something really wrong, people wouldn't really notice it. And then gradually I started to experiment more with painting, with what could I do to create not just a rendition of a subject, but an atmosphere to go along with it. So this is a painting that I made of a Mohawk settlement. This would have been around the time of contact, around early 1600s. I had visited the site. I had worked with an archaeologist who had done a dig on that site. This particular site is high above the Mohawk River background, out in the western part of the state, the Mohawk Valley, near the town of Canajoharie. And I tried other subject matter. I was, fascinated with trying to see where I could go and see what I could add to the genre of marine art. This is Lake George Village. Winter time, the lake is frozen over and covered with snow. Again, sort of playing with atmosphere. Then sort of the next big change came for me. This would have been in the late 90s, early 2000s. I had still been building cardboard models, and for very complex subjects, the models were getting bigger and bigger. This is a model of the Albany waterfront around 1782 or 3. And the model had become so big, I couldn't put it together in my studio. It just occupied too much space. So a friend of mine, Mickey Connolly, who owned an old piano factory that he was renovating, had some space, and I set the model up in there. And I think by the time I completed this model, it was over 20 feet long. So it was big, it was cumbersome. And I knew that this isn't the way to go about something of this scale. And it was around that time that I became aware of digital modeling. And that really changed everything. This is my computer setup. I'm sure you noticed that the historic telephone that I have here. But I would take plans. This is a contemporary plan of Schenectady that was drawn in the 1690s, and I learned how to digitally model that. And with that background, now I wasn't limited to the scale of a subject. I could tackle a city. I could tackle an enormous project, a complex project, something that would be way too difficult to physically build. And I could try different perspectives, a perspective that maybe I wasn't even considering until I could maneuver my way around a digital model. This is the Schenectady painting that came out of the model that you saw on my computer screens. And again, atmosphere. And atmosphere is something that I'm continually challenged by, but I'm continually trying to solve. This is the most recent painting that I did of Fort Orange. This was commissioned by the governor of New York. And in 2009, the painting was given to the royal family of the Netherlands. At the time, Princess Maxima and Prince Willem were in Albany for an event, and the governor presented a painting. But this is the most recent. So the buildings are a little bit different than the Fort Orange that I had painted 30 years before. The perspective is a little bit different. It's a bit more accurate, and there's a lot more going on. This is a large painting. Fort Orange is in the background. This is the arrival of a Dutch ship called the Gelderse Bloem, which came to Albany and brought settlers to the colony. And this is the skyline of Manhattan in 1660. Again, this subject, I would never try this subject if I had to build all those buildings physically, but I did build them digitally. And that's what gave me the texture of the city at that time. Hanover Square in Manhattan, that's what becomes Brooklyn a few years later. This is a view of the East River. The ship is the trow. The tip of Manhattan is in the background. This is Tiny Creek, which is near Albany. A Dutch bark and Mohawk warriors on their way out to investigate this strange vessel. They're in their elm bark canoes. This would be near the city of Troy today. And this is a painting of Troy set in the 1920s, the final construction of the Green Island Bridge. This is a painting that I made of a wonderful museum in Albany. This is one of the last, it may be the last, destroyer escort from World War II. And it's been restored and it's permanently docked at the Albany waterfront. And it's a wonderful museum. It's a great way to get a sense of what life was like on a ship during World War II. So I thought I'd end the program today with kind of where we started of Naples. And when my wife and I were there, we had taken a ferry from the town of Pozzuoli out to the island of Ischia. That's the big island right there. The little island down here at the bottom is Capri, and the Amalfi Coast is over here. There's Procida there. But I had photographed all this area because I had always thought the painting of my grandfather and his boat, the Liudo, from a perspective in this area, and I'll explain why I picked that spot. There's the Liudo, the photograph of the Liudo, and this is the painting. So what you have here is my grandfather Ando's vessel, and in the background, Mount on the big island of Ischia. And then off to the side is the island of Procida. That's where my grandfather was born. This is Baia. This is the town where my grandmother was born and grew up. This is Monte de Procida. That's the place where they lived when they were first married and where their first children were born. It's also where my grandfather died, and he's buried up there on a beautiful hilltop overlooking the Mediterranean. And so I close with this painting, an oil sketch of Ando's Liudo. And that's the end of part one. So if you'd like to kind of get into some questions and answers, I'd be happy to try to answer them for you.
And we did get a question. Thank you, Len, for your presentation. That was great, very, very informative. Just as you were wrapping up there, Thad and Irene asked, what media do you use for your paintings?
Well, I started out with pen and ink. You saw those. And then I started using watercolor in the architectural renderings. I used gouache for a while. when I started serious fine art painting, I was using acrylic. And for the last, I don't know, 30 years or so, I've been using oil. And of all of them, I enjoy the oil painting the most. I see it. I see the question.
Okay, okay.
Modeling program. I think um, they're all a little bit tricky to learn in the beginning, but the one that I like best is rhinoceros. It's referred to as Rhino 3D, and that seems to be the most intuitive and seems to be one that you can do the most with. So, but I also highly recommend Blender. Blender is an incredible program. It was designed and built by a very, very generous Dutchman who has decided that he would have this state-of-the-art program and make it available to anyone in the world for free. So Blender can do lots and lots and lots of stuff. So between Rhinoceros and Blender, and there are a number of other programs that I use for other things, people and stuff like that. But those are the primarily the two that I use the most.
Kevin and Mary asked, how long does a painting or a project take?
Well, they can take from. I think I hope that many of you get to the exhibition at the Albany Institute, because in the exhibition you'll see paintings that have taken me 6, 8 months to do, and then there's a little case of plein air paintings that I made. I think many were done in an hour or so. And the reason why they were done in an hour or so is that Corliss and I would be on vacation somewhere, and I'd say, oh, gee, I have to paint that my gear. And Cor would stop the car, and I'd get out of the car and take all my gear, and she'd say, I'll see you in an hour. And she'd just drive off. So I knew that I had an hour to get the thing done. And so that's why those are sketchier pieces, but they were fun to do. I think the one that took the longest isn't in the exhibition because it's the biggest painting that I ever did. In its frame, it's 10 feet long, and it was done for, at the time, Key Bank. It's now owned by the Omni Corp. That painting took me a year, and I didn't work on anything else. I just worked on that one project.
Dave asked, why did you make the painting at Papscani? My immigrant ancestor Klaus Van Petten lived there when they threw him out of the Schenectady stockade before 1690.
Yeah. There were a number of buildings there, and but I think what really kind of turned me on to that site was I had been doing some work for Jim Bradley, who was collaborating with Paul Huey on a book of about archaeological sites in the Albany area, and they they decided that they were going to introduce me to the world of archaeology, and so they took me to a site, and they said it would happen to be a recently plowed cornfield. So there was no planting done, but the earth had been turned over. And they said, we're going to fan out in this field. We're going to be about 100 feet apart, and we're going to very slowly walk from one corner of the field to the other. And we want you to look down. And in this area, there shouldn't be a stone in this field that's larger than a baseball. If you come across something that's larger than a baseball, it was put here for some purpose. I mean, both of these guys already knew what I was going to find. They sort of set this up. That's why they put me on this particular track. So we're walking along, and I'm kicking the ground because I noticed that they're kicking the ground. So I'm kicking the ground, and dust is coming up, and I'm looking down, and I spot a couple funny. Spotted a couple of stones that were about the size of a basketball, and then I noticed a piece of a brick and um, a fragment of a pipe. And what we wound up talking about and what I wound up experiencing was a debris field from a 17th century farm. This was in the vicinity of Papskenny. And we talked about it, and they said that they had done work there in sometime before that. And they said within this debris field, we found evidence of windows, we found evidence of tiles, and I thought if I took all of that information and my sense of what the site was like, I could come up with some kind of a conjectural representation of what might have been there. Now, the Papskenny painting, that's one I did a couple of Papskenny paintings. They are conjectural, but they are based on debris that was found in those loads.
Lori just asked, you must have just broke up for a minute, for you to restate who owns the 10-foot painting now.
Oh, that's owned, but it's in the Omni building, which was it's right across from the Albany Arena, and it hangs in the lobby there. You can see it from the street. It hangs over the main desk. Just walk in, and the great big painting on the wall is the one that we're talking about.
Luann asked if you ever work on more than one painting at a time.
I don't paint. I'm not in the. I don't get into the process of actually painting more than one painting at the same time. But what I have been doing lately, this question's been asked before, and I thought, well, I kind of do work on more than one at a time. I'll have the painting that's on my easel, the one that's actually where the paint is actually wet and I'm actually doing something with it. But I start to think about the next project, what the next project might be. And I'll start to do the research on that project. And if it starts to move along to a point where I think I can begin a digital model of it, I start that. And then I start to divide my day up between research, modeling, and then painting. And I've been doing more and more of that process lately. It isn't that it's that I'm I am interested in each aspect of that, and I have to be kind of careful that I don't get so focused on one aspect of it that I neglect the other ones. That's the process that I use now.
How did you begin painting boats?
Boats?
Yes.
Well, I have a painting, not a painting. I have a little sketch that's going to be shown in upcoming videos, part of this series. But I have a sketch that I made when I was 11 years old of a pilot boat and a square rigger in New York Harbor. It's pretty clunky, and it's obviously the work of an elementary school kid. But yeah, I've always been interested in them. I think it's because growing up, I had heard those stories about my grandfather and his experiences in the Mediterranean, and it piqued my interest. And so that's what I think started the course.
We have one person who would like to ask a question but isn't able to type it. So I'd like to invite Norman Bauman to go ahead and unmute himself, and he can ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I've been sailing the river for about 30 years, and due to the Tantillo, people never knew what a treasure the Hudson River is and the history. And anybody who really would want to find out what it was 100 years ago, make sure that you see his studio, make sure that you see some of his work. Work is displayed all over. I wasn't paid to say that.
So anyway, let me say a few words about Norman. Norman's been a friend of mine for a very long time. Norman's a very, very, very skilled sailor himself. Norman was married for many years to Mary Jo Doherty, who was a dear, dear, dear friend of mine. Unfortunately, she passed away a few years ago. I know that she would have been delighted with the Institute exhibition, and a number of the marine paintings that I enjoyed making the most were purchased by Norman and Mary Jo. And so when you go to the exhibition, just keep that in mind. One of them is the Horizon of the Last Sailor. Oh, yeah. And my wife is here, so she's reminding me that we went sailing with Norman on his boat quite a few times. And he always, I'm a creature comfort guy. And this is an old sailing vessel with pretty basic accommodations. The bunks were just basically boards. And I won't get into all the other facilities on the boat, but he always teased me because I brought my own pillow with me.
Ed and Margot just asked if you could re-say, you showed a painting that was a creek near Albany. Could you reconfirm what the creek was near Albany?
Yeah, it's the Papskenny Creek. At one time, it was one of the boundaries of Papskenny Island, but it's not an island anymore. It's a lot of that waterway has been filled in. So it's still there. I mean, it's not something that you can easily sail into, but there's a lot of history in that place. It was settled by the Native Americans who lived here. They were probably mostly Mohicans who lived on that land, but there were Dutch farmsteads there from the middle to the end of the 17th century, and it's interesting because they still grow corn on that land, and they've been there for countless eons. The Indians were growing corn there long the arrival of Europeans.
Leslie asked, can we expect a publication based on the current exhibition, and will it include your autobiography?
Yes, as a matter of fact. Oh, this is wonderful. I get to plug the book. Yeah, so I did put together a book for the exhibition. It's fairly extensive. It's 232 pages. There are numerous essays by noted historians, including Charlie Huey. But there are other essays in there by Dennis Micah. The introductory essay was written by Russell Shorto, the incredible writer who created Island at the Center of the World. And there are over 100 paintings in the book. It's available now on Amazon. It's called A Sense of Time, 40 Years of History Painting. And it's also within a couple of weeks going to be available at the Albany Institute. Yeah, it's out there, and it's pretty much an overview of the entire show and some of the things that we talked today and some of the things we will be talking about.
Kevin and Mary asked if you could share some information about the train behind you.
Yeah, okay. A couple of, I guess this happens to a lot of artists, but over the course of your career, you lose track of paintings. Owners change, people pass away, and paintings are sold off in estate sales. And a couple of what I think of as my two strongest, among the strongest of the railroad paintings that I've done, Washington Street in Syracuse, which is a great big painting, and a painting that depicts the Schoharie Valley Railroad. That was another piece that I enjoyed making. Well, anyway, we weren't able to get either one of those for the exhibit, and I was particularly bothered by not being able to exhibit the Schoharie piece. And I think it was mostly because of the experience that I had painting. Railroad historians, I mean, these guys knew so much about railroading. Len Killian, who had written a book about the Schoharie Valley Railroad, and my very, very dear friend Dave Gould, who has passed away. When I was working on that locomotive, I was modeling it. I really didn't know what I was doing. I had no idea what the dimensions, the gauge between the wheels were. I had no idea how the boiler was arranged. Well, anyway, those guys would come to the studio once a week. We'd have a cup of coffee or a glass of wine, and I'd get a critique on the model. You don't have this right, or this is a little bit different. And they'd bring books. You know, here's a photograph of a detail, and then losing touch with those guys, it made me very sad. And the fact that there wasn't a painting that depicted that experience, I thought, well, I have some time right now. I'm going to make a painting of just that locomotive, and that's what's on the easel behind me. And I can't. Every time I work on that, I think about those two guys, and I almost feel like I owe it to them for all the time they gave me to create an image that that portrays the beauty of that little conglomerate locomotive. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't famous. It only operated for 8 miles on 8 miles of track. It served as a school bus, and you've probably heard the expression milk train or milk run. That's what that was. The Borden plant was in Schoharie, New York, and that little engine pulled the Borden dairy car from one town to the next town where the car would be transferred to the D&H Railroad. So it has this kind of homespun and history. It's the kind of thing that's easily forgotten and rusts away and gets sold for scrap. And so I like memorializing it, and in my own way, memorializing the two men that I enjoyed working with so much.
Patrick asked if you've ever tried doing city waterfronts from around the country.
Not well, probably my one excursion outside of New Netherland, which New Netherland sort of encompassed part of Connecticut and most of New York, and pieces of in the beginning a little bit of Massachusetts, but as far south as Delaware. So I've been involved with those areas, but about 2 years ago, I was asked if I would do a Canadian painting, and so I took on the project of depicting Quebec City in the 1740s, and that was challenging because so much of it was different. I was familiar with Dutch vessels and English vessels, but not so much French vessels. And Quebec and Montreal played a part in New York State history, so I felt that it fit in the work that I was doing. So I did it. That painting is included in the book, and it's also included in the exhibition. It belongs to the Minnesota Marine Art Museum, and they have generously lent 2 other paintings to the exhibit, one of Manhattan and one of a lighthouse in the outer harbor of New York. But I've tried to keep my work contained within the bounds of this region, because it's an area that is very underrepresented in history. I mean, when I was growing up, I thought history other places. I thought history happened in um, Washington and Philadelphia and Boston. I never, and New York City. I never associated history with where I lived. Um, and so I think that if I have found a niche, it's in exploring the history under my feet here in New York and in the environs around here, um, and adding to that documentary information. So that's why I've tried to limit my area to the greater New York region.
Well, this ties in. Holly asked if you've ever painted any pictures of Hudson River ice boats.
No, I haven't. I know where there's a great example of one. It's in the ice boat that belonged to Franklin Roosevelt is at the Hudson River Maritime Museum in Kingston, and but I've never painted one.
And Ed asked if you've ever given any consideration to illustrating former West Albany railroad shops.
Well, I did. Probably the closest I came to that was not railroad shops themselves, but there was a famous engine built there in the 1890s, Engine 999, designed for one purpose and one purpose alone. And it's kind of interesting because this is sort of a segue from the question about the ice boats. Ice boats travel at very high speeds, 80, 90, more miles per hour on the ice. They're just not limited by the same kind of friction. Well, in the 1890s, there was a race on between the major railroads in the United States, the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad and the Pennsylvania Railroad, who could build the fastest locomotive, a locomotive that would set a world record. And the Pennsylvania Railroad made their attempt at it, but the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad and the West Albany shops decided that they were going to build an engine that would be so fast that they would competition. So they started this project. This locomotive was designed for one purpose alone, and that was just to go fast. It had 6-foot diameter driver wheels. And in May of 1893, engine 999 was clocked over miles an hour on a flat stretch of track near Batavia, New York. And I did paint engine 999.
I'm going to, I think these are two good questions to sort of combine, and I think they're good to sort of wrap us up today. So Lori has asked if you could tell us a bit about what's in the exhibit, and Oscar has asked that this was mentioned as the first part of our webinars. What more can we expect out of our future talks? So if you want to give us just a quick overview and
Okay.
any tidbits you might want to share about what we might discuss in future programs, and then we can sign off today.
I can tell you this. There'll be more history, lots more history. I intend to review the native and Dutch periods. I probably will devote a whole video on just that subject. Then I'd like to do at least one on how I find a subject. What catches my attention? Why do I pick a particular thing to depict? There'll be a program about that, and then I'm going to do at least one completely take a painting apart and discuss the aspects of what went into it: research, the sketching, the development of the idea, and then eventually figuring out how it would be painted, and then ultimately how the painting resolves. So those things. I've also thought about a few other things, like when I was first starting out, the people who appear in the paintings were real people, and so I was going to talk a little bit about people who volunteered to be in paintings, and how they got their costumes for the paintings, and we may go into what I'm planning for the future. So in general, that's what's coming.
That's great. Well, thank you, Len, for your talk today. Thank you, everybody who was able to join us and who asked questions. Like I said at the beginning, I did promise that I would at least have a date for our next program. So Sunday, March 21st at 2 p.m. will be the next program. So please keep an eye on our website, albanyinstitute.org, for announcements of our future topic and for registration. And once again, thank you everybody who joined us. Thank you, Len. I saw everybody was giving you the virtual round of applause, so I will lead that now too. So thank you everybody who was able to join us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day or evening.
Yeah, and I want to thank everybody for participating. It's really difficult without a live audience because I don't know whether this is working or it's not working, but I can see most of your faces, and I didn't see that many people fall asleep, so that's a very, very good sign. So anyway, thank you for coming.
There are many great comments, way more comments than I can even read, but everybody is saying thank you very much. Keep up the wonderful work. Appreciate your time and expertise, Len. Thank you so much. I've enjoyed this and look forward to the future talks, as well as seeing the exhibition in person. And the book, some people have said that the book is now at the museum shop at the Albany Institute. So you can purchase it on Amazon and both at the Albany Institute. So thank you everybody for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.